Hi, hello, watchers, listeners, viewers. I'm Maura Aarons-Mele. As always, if you have a question for Dr. Thomas Curran or for me, put it in the chat, comment, experience, share away. Tell us how you're feeling today and where you are. I want to welcome Dr. Thomas Curran. I'm going to call you Thomas in our talk today, who is an associate professor at the London School of Economics. I had the honor of studying there for a year. It was the best education, and a real expert on perfectionism, my favorite topic to talk about. And we're going to dive in. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about it. And I didn't know you studied at LSE. That's wonderful to hear.
I did. And I have to tell you something funny. I got the worst grades. I had been used to, in the American system, always, sailing through with A's. And I got to the LSE and oh my goodness, my end of year marks were terrible, but I did fall in love at the end of the year at the same time. So I've never been sure which was which. Like, was I just distracted or was I really not smart enough to study at the LSE?
Well, that's a much better prize in my opinion. So,
Yes, it was fun. So it's great to have you. I want to just start at brass tacks. I would like you to give us the clinical definition of perfectionism and then how you might use it colloquially when you see it happening in people.
Well, the clinical definition of perfectionism would be an extreme form of neurosis, essentially, a sense of not ever being satisfied with ourselves, a chronic and almost unbearable sense of self-criticism, self-loathing that comes from an inner deficit and in a need to feel like, or an inner feeling that we're not enough. Now, I'm not a clinician, so I don't deal with cutoffs or diagnoses, but that would be how most clinicians would recognize a perfectionist. I'm a researcher, and what we tend to do is think about perfectionism as a spectrum. So we think about whether someone is or isn't perfectionistic, and how far along they are on that spectrum. And I think that's a useful way to look at perfectionism in a number of ways. One, it means we can measure variance. So that means we can test for correlations, things like that. But it also means that perfectionism is on a sliding scale. So yes, we can be high in a moment, but that doesn't mean that we can't, through various strategies, move down that scale and kind of temper some of the more negative aspects of perfectionism.
Right. And we may be perfectionistic about something, but not perfectionistic about another thing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that happens a lot. We all have an idealized image in our minds, right, of the perfect person we want other people to see. This is very much the perfectionistic psyche. And that, for me, that's, for instance, I want to be the perfect professor. I want to give the perfect lectures. But then if I'm playing like five-a-side football in my social time and I screw up a kick or something, like I'm not that bothered. So it just depends where we are and how important that context is in terms of how triggering our perfectionism will be.
Talk more about the spectrum. I love a good spectrum. So tell me about, and again, I'm asking you, this is just fun. This is just a LinkedIn Live. Someone who's at the high end of the spectrum for perfectionism, how they might find it affecting their day-to-day life versus someone who's, got some tendencies, but it manages it or it just pops up sometimes.
Well, I suppose it's the extent to which it consumes you. Perfectionism can really take over at its most extreme. You can feel like there's no escape. Perfectionism kind of trap. I call perfectionism perfection trap in my book, because really it's a trap between two bookends. On the one side, when we fail or slip up, those negative ruminative thoughts come in and we feel really bad about ourselves, our self-esteem plummets. But then on the other hand, when we do happen to do something well, we can't derive any lasting satisfaction from those achievements, because the better we do, the better we feel like we're expected to do. It's this kind of never-ending treadmill. So you're kind of trapped and pincer between these two bookends with no escape. It's really exhausting. There's a lot of burnout, a lot of mental health struggles, particularly around low mood and anxiety. So on the extreme end, those are the kinds of thought processes, those are the kind of emotions, those are the kind of conditions that you tend to see. Now, obviously not everybody is there. Some people have a little bit of that, and it affects them in certain periods of their life, but not others. Some people have a lot more where it kind of takes over, and it's most people are sort of more or less in the middle, where a little bit of this, a little bit no. So that's kind of, I think, a useful way to think about perfectionism. And if you do find it's consuming, you do start to feel that kind of trap a lot in your life, that is when perfectionism might be having a negative impact.
Yeah, the trap is such a powerful metaphor, What's the relationship between perfectionism and anxiety?
Very, very strong. We studied this now for many, many decades, and the correlations are always very high, about 25% variance explained, which, by the way, for correlation research in psychology is big. So perfectionism has a very, very strong relationship. And I don't think there's any surprise if, from what we know about perfectionism, it comes from a place of extreme deficit, thing that we lack. And so we go through the world trying to gain other people's approval and validation. But of course, that's not always forthcoming. And there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, a lot of introspection on what's wrong with us, particularly when we've made a mistake or screwed up publicly. And so they're very stress reactive. They can be very vulnerable in those moments, and those ruminative thoughts, anxiety can really start to peak. And if they're left unchecked, they could really turn into generalized forms of anxiety in a lot of cases. So yeah, look, there's a very, very strong relationship between perfection and anxiety because of that deficit thinking.
Yeah. And I find, just personally, when I'm in an anxious place, I act it out with perfectionism. So it's a real behavior for me.
Absolutely. Well, it's driven. I mean, that is the fuel of fumes of, the fuel of perfectionism really is. It is anxiety, it's insecurity, about a worry about like not being enough and not feeling like we're recognized or that we matter to other people. That's, if you want to get at the root of this thing, it's really about not feeling like we matter or are loved by those around us. And of course, that's a very anxious way of going about the world. You're not going to feel satisfied. It's not a place that really is going to provide a sense of contentment or any kind of joy. And so, yes, we can go quite far under the fumes of anxiety, absolutely, but it's not sustainable.
No, and that's really what the anxious achiever is all about, right? You can get far.
You can.
And then it just
I can tell you that from personal experience.
Well, tell us, yes. Why did you devote your life to this?
Well, I come from a working class background and always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I'd say, you feel like you're inferior and you've got to climb so much higher. And objectively, that's true, by the way. But at the same time, you can really take that on as part of your identity. That you've got to constantly strive and lift yourself above other people all the time. Because if you don't, then you're just going to fall back and nobody's going to care, and you can get a really bad job, and everything's going to fall around. This is the catastrophizing part of perfectionism, by the way, that happens. So the anxiety really just drove me forward, but it drove me forward in a very unproductive, unsustainable way. So you work evenings, weekends, you sacrifice areas of life that are important, like relationships, didn't bother with those, friendships, didn't really bother with those either. I just was working, work, throwing myself into it and just worrying all the time about how I was doing relative to other people, looking over my shoulder. What's the PhD student next to me doing? What's the colleague across the corridor doing? How can I make sure that I look better than them or working harder than them? Look, it does get you far. Don't get me wrong. I was promoted very quickly, and now I'm working at LSE. But at the same time, the sacrifices I made to get me there, like mental health struggles constantly, relational difficulties, not feeling like I'm settled or rooted in any one community. It's not a good way to live, and actually, it's not a productive way to live either. Once you realize that perfection is actually holding you back way more than it's pushing you forward, you can look at life in a completely different way and be just as productive. That's the thing. You don't have to do it this way. There are alternatives, but first of all, you've got to break free of that myth of perfection. So
how? I know we don't have a long time here, but I feel personally, I've been trying to break free my whole 30s and 40s, to be honest. And I would say I have been about 40% successful, but old stories don't die very easily. And it's habitual.
Yeah. Oh, no. There's no quick fix to this. If you're looking for a life hack, you're not going to find it in my writing or literature. And that's certainly the case for clinicians too. If you read clinical case reports of overcoming perfectionism, it's a long road, and with a lot of dips and troughs. Like, you're going to fall back into the trap of perfectionism. You're going to fall back into the the need to manage impressions and worry about how other people are perceiving you, and that's just normal. It's very natural. You haven't got to be a perfectionist about rehabilitation from perfectionism. That's also very important. And just know that the most important thing in overcoming perfectionism is really about vulnerability. I know Brené Brown talks a lot about vulnerability. I think it's so important. We have to be brave. I mean, you have to take those first steps in a different direction of being able to just get out of our comfort zone a little bit and show ourselves to the world little by little. Don't obviously throw everything out there all at once, but put your hand up to do a presentation if you don't feel very comfortable in that domain. Maybe lead a project that you were a bit hesitant about leading. Write some code just for fun. Even if it doesn't work, just try it. These are very small things that you can do tomorrow, but pushing yourself little by little helps you get comfortable with uncertainty. You know what I mean? Like comfortable with falling short a little bit. And when you do that, be kind to yourself. That's also important, because you're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. The more vulnerable you are, the more people are going to have something to say, the more you maybe screw up. But just be kind to yourself. That's so important. So self-compassion, vulnerability are really crucial when it comes to perfectionism.
You said self-compassion. I reflexively put my hand on my sternum to give myself a little. So this is a show about work and leadership and success. And so here's to me where the rubber meets the road with this kind of stuff, which is that, and this is why I think your work is so fascinating, because you truly view this from a culture and society lens.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. We live in a culture, and those of us who are high performers probably work at a place where we have inculcated that what we view as perfect is what we need to do every single day. And it is dangerous to screw up. It can be downright dangerous. It can be dangerous to be vulnerable. What is the real world recipe for the person who truly feels stuck in the trap where I am a perfectionist and I live in a culture and work in a culture that seems to expect this from me? I don't have room to experiment.
And there's a truth to that.
Yeah.
And this is why, in my book, I was very clear about you can do all of these things and still find at the end of it all that it's a difficult culture and a difficult environment that you have to navigate, and you have to be pragmatic about that. I think first of all, it's really important that we have to win the argument, because so many people still think that perfectionism is the route to success, but there is no evidence whatsoever for that in the workplace. Perfectionists work hard. Yes, they do. And we just talked about how far you can go, but it's not sustainable. They will burn out, and they'll end up, taking more time off work in the long run, which also impacts not just on themselves, but also the firm or the company.
And they can be avoidant as well, right?
And exactly right. And they can also be very avoidant. So, if you put them in unpredictable situations where they're likely to find difficult, then they tend to procrastinate. They tend to worry. And instead of just getting on with it, they tend to find ways of getting out of it. Of course, and that's not conducive to success either. So I think we have to win the argument that perfectionism is not the way to go. It feels very satisfying in this fast-paced world, just try and be perfect, and that's the way to go. But actually we have to think a little bit smarter, that actually sometimes less is more. And if we come to work rejuvenated, vitalized, if we look after ourselves and practice self-care, if we give ourselves permission to take time off when we need it. All these things sound a bit like slacking or whatever, but actually in the long run, and there's so much evidence out there to show that if you come to work vitalized, rejuvenated, you're going to be more productive. And that's just a switch up in the way that we think about society, organizations, about what is success and what's the recipe for success.
But your research finds that, I think, that we are becoming more perfectionistic as a culture. Is that right? How is it changing?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we're seeing that a lot in the data around young people. And particularly social expectations for perfection. We're seeing that grow at an exponential rate. And of course, look, there's way more to it than with the workplace. The workplace is more pressurized, and there is a lot of insecurity and worry among younger generations that, they kind of need to hustle and grind to work their way up. So I think these things are important, but also you've got social media, you've got really competitive school and college. It's not easy out there for young people. I know they're often derided sometimes as being snowflakes or whatever, but it is hard. And they are responding with perceptions that the world is becoming more expected and more pressurized. So yes, we are seeing that in the data, and that's incumbent on people who work in high performing organizations to recognize that you're going to see a lot of this in your organizations. Young people are going to come with a lot of perfectionism, and I think it's your job to recognize that and work out how you can create those cultures of psychological safety that just don't press too hard on their buttons when it comes to overworking, overthinking, and you know what I mean, like ruminating about mistakes or whatever. It's about creating a safe culture where people can just fail, and that's okay. As long as they learn and keep growing, that's the most important thing.
That's right. And I want to plug Amy Edmondson's fantastic book, The Right Kind of Wrong, which has tons of evidence-based ways that failure is helpful. So your research has found, though, that when perfectionistic people fail, especially if others notice it, they feel guilt and shame that they have given a flawed performance. They've screwed up. How, if I'm a boss working with someone like this, how do I coach them out of it? How do I help them?
Well, I'd second that recommendation of Amy Edmondson's book. It's a wonderful book. And it's not easy. Again, it's just like it's not easy on a personal level to turn the corner on perfectionism. It's also difficult on an organizational level to keep maintaining high standards and aiming high, whilst at the same time kind of making sure that we're creating environments where mistakes or, let's say, failure is welcomed and embraced. Or at least people have permission to do that. There's a couple of things I think you can do tomorrow as managers. The first one is to just humanize failure, humanize mistakes. You're going to make mistakes, and you have made mistakes. And so when you have your team meetings, just be open about them. I think that's so important. Normalize them, laugh about them. Just make sure that people know it's okay.
Yep.
Because the last thing you want in your team is a culture whereby the people are afraid to make mistakes because they're going to withhold information, which then you find out at a later date becomes a real problem for progress on the project, and it could cost lots and lots of money. So it's actually way, way more productive for the firm and the company to encourage people to say, I think I made a mistake there. We need to talk about it, right? So open lines of communication. And the only way you do that is through normalizing it.
Right. And so if you're the leader, I'll never forget when my kids were in kindergarten here, their teacher said to the parents, you should say things like, oh, mommy messed up. Mommy made a mistake. Mommy put salt in the bread instead of sugar, whatever. Mommy's late to pick you up. Because if they see mommy doing it, not that I'm a mommy at work, but this is, you get it. It's an analogy. The person who is their everything in the world, they will feel it's acceptable.
Yeah, and exactly. And that's creating the culture. That's creating the culture where you've got high standards. Of course, we want to aim high. We want to make sure that whatever we're developing is of a standard. Of course, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, it's so important to make sure that those mistakes and failures are accepted, embraced, and that we move on. We make sure we iterate, develop. And also, the other thing that's really important is to make sure that people know in an organization when it's good enough. There can come out. You can overwork. A chef can overwork the cream into butter. It does happen, right? And sometimes it's just about getting things off, right? Mm-hmm. You can iterate, you can edit later, but when it's good enough, send it out. Be brave, and that's something also that we can emphasize within our teams. Is don't overthink it. Let's get it out there. And move on to the next thing. So that's the other, I think, important message that people need to hear.
I want to ask you about competition. You've done research on the role that global competition or that competition for resources play. What's the relationship between perfectionism and competition or living in a highly competitive structure or working in one?
Well, my feeling is that we do live in a competitive world. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and that's by design. I mean, this is the way that economies grow, right? They grow through innovation, competition, people working and consuming, and working and consuming some more. And the way that we do that is to create scarcity. So, that we need more. We need the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And if you don't work hard, someone else is going to take the job. This is the hamster wheel of growth, and it's worked phenomenally well. Like, we live in a society of immense abundance. But there does come a time when things start to slow, that the link between growth and happiness begins to weaken. And that's where we've been now for the last 20 or 30 years. And I think we're struggling with that a little bit. I think we're finding that still vastly competitive society, extreme pressures to excel and achieve, but inside an economy is quite giving as much back. And young people are finding it a bit harder to get on. They're finding it a bit harder to get promoted. And they're seeing that their efforts are not necessarily being matched with the same rewards that perhaps their parents were. And that's quite psychologically challenging for young people. And of course, they take it on themselves in this culture, that's something that's wrong with them. They're not working hard enough. They're not doing enough. They need to do more. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you want to look at the macro level, is perhaps where perfectionism is growing. And so, I would say competition, individualism, growth, these things all play into the growth of perfectionism.
So competing for scarce resources.
Yes, but artificial scarcity. It's really important to mention that. Like we do live in a world of abundance, but we can't enjoy it, because if we were to enjoy it, the economy would stop growing, and then the things that we do need would begin to disappear. Mm-hmm. This is
because we're a consumption-based economy.
Because we're a consumption-based economy, and so if we suddenly feel like we're enough, people would stop consuming, jobs would be lost. The knock-on impacts are quite profound. So in some ways, this is systemic. This is a systemic issue that we are experiencing. Now, look, I make no moral judgment about whether that's right or wrong, but I do think we need to diagnose the problem. And it's sourced correctly, because otherwise we take it on ourselves and we wonder why we feel like this, when actually there's a broader context to those feelings. So I don't offer any solution or say that we need to do X, Y, or Z, but what I do say is I think it's important we all recognize that it's okay, that this is the way the society is organized, this is the way the economies work, and that takes a little bit of personal heat of those feelings, and hopefully allows us to feel a little bit better about ourselves, knowing that it's not all our fault.
It's funny you say that. I'll share a personal reflection, and viewers, please jump in. I have been at a battle with my aging, because as a woman in society, getting older is not acceptable, and looking like you're getting older is not acceptable. And of course, it's a gazillion-dollar industry. And a few years ago, I just started thinking, although IRS, I do not charge it as a business expense, I just started thinking of my anti-aging costs as a business expense. I sort of was like, you're part of the system. You make money by public speaking and being out there. So you're going to get Botox. You're paying the system. And I can't tell you how much it released me from the perfectionism I felt and had felt for decades as a woman needing to look a certain way.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a cynical view, but I hear your point, in which we are all cogs in a wheel that sort of drives the constant quest to reach something we never will.
Yeah, and that's how it's supposed to be, right? Like, there is no endpoint. Where is the endpoint? The line just goes like this. There's no point at which this economy could stop growing. And look, I think we just have to recognize that it's not about changing the world or whatever. It's just about recognizing that this is how it is. And it's interesting that you mentioned the pressures on women, because the first psychoanalyst to really start wrestling with perfectionism is someone called Curran, whose ideas are still alive today. One incredible thinker, definitely worth checking out. But essentially, she said exactly what the issues that you were wrestling with there. That women in that society have to bend themselves all out of proportion to conform to an ideal, and that moves them further and further away from who they actually are. And so they feel alienated from themselves, which creates an incredible amount of tension and internal conflict between the real person, imperfect person they are, and this perfect person that they're trying to project into the world. And so, that is one of the ways in which society and its images of limitless perfection, which today now are just kind of everywhere, creates this aura of perfection into which perfectionism thrives.
But there's something about self-esteem and perfectionism that I wanted to ask you about, because part of what I think people who are perfectionistic should be proud of is that they think they can be great. They're in the arena. And so there is a level of perfectionists here who are like, oh no, I deserve to be here. I hate myself and I can only be lovable if I'm there, but I can get there. It's a little bit of, I don't know what the right word is, not ego, but like, if you are in the arena trying to be a perfectionist, you believe in yourself at some level. You have to.
Of course. And by the way, perfectionism is a part of our identity.
Yeah.
That's why it's one of the hardest things to let go, because and this is why you talk to any clinician and they'll tell you this. Perfectionism is really difficult to treat because it's so closely held. We will try and dispense with all other parts of our identity first before we let go of perfectionism.
Really?
Why do we hold it so dear? Because we think that when everything and all around us is collapsing, we feel like everything's going wrong and we're really in a hole. We think perfectionism is the one thing that's keeping us above ground. We think it's the one thing holding us up in the world. And what we don't realize is that it's perfectionism that's exacerbating all those stresses and strains. It's elongating them, and it's creating even more profound stress, anxiety, and depression because of the way perfectionism makes us vulnerable to distress and makes us push through the pain when really we should be stopping, we should be resting, we should be recuperating. So, perfectionism is difficult to treat for that very reason that you're saying, that people hold it so dear to their identity and will never let it go.
No, it's a profound piece and it's rewarded.
And it's absolutely rewarded. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you have to watch TV or turn on a podcast or whatever, and there's inevitably someone, stolen the virtues of overwork and 80-hour weeks and all the rest of it. Of course, it's lionized in this culture, but I do think we have to think a little bit smarter and be very suspicious of people who say these things, because what we don't see in the background of these people who have made all these sacrifices, successes, is people who are doing the invisible labor behind the scenes. What we don't hear is, who's looking after the children when they're working evenings and weekends, for example. We don't see the handouts that maybe they got when they were younger. They don't see the social circles they grew up into. If they're athletes, for instance, they may have extremely good genes that have given them the advantages that they needed to succeed in that domain. Look, there are so many factors, right, that are going on behind the scenes that are way more important than perfectionism. But of course, all we see is the tip of the iceberg. So we see the perfectionism and we think that's got to be the reason they're successful. But there's so many reasons behind it.
Right. And social media, you can't tell.
And that's the problem with social media.
You can't tell. Anyone can be rich on social media. That's what I like to say. As we close out here, I want to flip it. I want to talk about the effects of perfectionism and expectations on others. There are 3 kinds of perfectionism. I'd like you to just briefly mention those and then talk about, because I hear this a lot, my boss has crazy expectations. They're so perfectionistic. I can't ever live up.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So in short, perfectionism is multifaceted. There's many different forms. It comes from within. This is called self-oriented perfectionism, so high self-set goals and expectations. But it can also come from outside of us too. So perfectionist people often feel like other people expect them to be perfect, and they are very anxious when they haven't been perfect because they feel other people are watching and waiting to pounce. And then there's perfectionism that's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And then there's perfectionism turned outwards onto others. It's called other-oriented perfectionism, which is the kind of perfectionism that you're hinting at there, which is high goals for other people. I expect you to be perfect, and if you're not, I'm going to let you know. And I'm sure listeners will have encountered an other-oriented perfectionist, and because you can't forget them. And this is the issue. How do you come around? It's very difficult. First thing to remember is that this is a projection of their own high standards onto other people. So this is a them problem, not a you problem. That's the first thing to remember first and foremost. Often you can internalize that as, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? not the case. Secondly, I think it's really important to have a frank and honest conversation with another perfectionist or someone that's being too demanding. But before you do that, compile a dossier of evidence. Why is it that their expectations are unreasonable? Why is it that you can't be possibly expected to do X in a Y time frame, right? And detail why. Why it's just simply not possible. I would be working evenings, weekends to get this done. It's not realistic. It's not feasible. It's going above and beyond. And once you open up that channel of communication, then you can start to recalibrate and work with them to recalibrate the goals downwards. And as long as it's evidence-based and as long as there is a clear rationale, then a conversation or at least a compromise can begin to be made. But I would always say, talk to them. Don't withhold, don't avoid. It just makes the problem worse. Confront it face on.
And maybe have compassion for them.
Well, that goes back to the first point, right? Like this, it's a projection. So you have to also remember that, this is part of their own worries and insecurities about not being perfect.
I worked with someone once who said, you wouldn't want to live inside my head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I always thought was great,
Yeah. No, it's so true. It's so true. We have to also be, just as we're compassionate to ourselves, we have to be compassionate to other people. That's how we're going to break down perfectionism.
I just would love to leave with you reflecting on how you practice compassion towards your perfectionistic self. What has worked? What do you do? What works for you?
You got to work really hard at it. So the first thing, you have to be very conscious of your reactions or your response style when things haven't gone well. Because what I used to do in the past is ruminate on it for days and days. And depending on how big the mistake was, you may be ruminating for weeks and weeks. Of course, that's really unhealthy, and it's very creates a lot of anxiety and low mood. So what I do now is whenever I do make mistakes, I put in a performance I don't think is very good. Often the instant response, the response style will be go in on yourself. But it's important to check that and write it down. Sometimes what I'll do is if I come out of lecture, I don't think I've done very well, I might feel really bad about myself in that moment. It's just the way it is. But I come up and I write down the thoughts, why do I feel bad? What was it about the talk that didn't go so well? And then I try to think about a compassionate way to move forward in that moment. So, I didn't answer a question very well. Well, you can't possibly be expected to be across every minutiae detail of this topic. So it's okay. Maybe email the student in question with a more detailed answer once you've had time to look at it yourself, right? So this is a constructive, compassionate way to move forward. So diarying and writing down your thoughts and those more debilitating self-critical thoughts, I think is really important. And then next to them, thinking about what's a more constructive and compassionate way to move forward is a way to completely eradicate that long ruminative kind of thinking that goes unchecked if you don't engage in this process.
Yeah.
Right. So it's so important. You might think you haven't got time for it, but trust me, it will save you more time in the long run if you deal with it in the moment.
And I would imagine you see patterns emerging too, in how what triggers you off and how you respond or how you react.
Exactly. So there'll be different triggers. There'll be different things that you do that elicit different response pattern that might not be very positive. And it's just be introspective about that. And if you diary them, you will begin to see patterns, and that makes you a lot more prepared in the moment if it happens again. Self-reflection, self-analysis is really, really crucial. And that was what Karen Horney recommended. And it's also something I try to apply in my own life. What
is the role also of psychodynamic therapy, of looking back into the childhood? I mean, the reflections piece is very active. It's in the moment. It's behavior, but as you've mentioned, like these things run deep. They're old stories often. Do you think that people who struggle with perfectionism should think about therapy as well?
Absolutely.
More psychodynamic talk therapy, not maybe, a CBT or other oriented.
Well, it all depends on the roots of perfectionism. And I think if there are things unresolved from early childhood, I think it's really important to see a therapist, because we know from the literature that there is strong links between early life trauma, abandonment, neglect with perfectionism in later life. It's a compensatory mechanism to feel like we're loved or that we matter. This is just a lot of literature to support that. Again, I'm not a clinician, so I just want to be careful. I'm not straying too far outside of my area of expertise, because it is a sensitive topic. But I would 100% recommend clinical intervention. Is evidence-based, and there's very, very good people out there who have had amazing results when it comes to perfectionism that's rooted in those things. So absolutely. And there are other forms of therapy too that have good evidence. Acceptance commitment therapy, I think, is also one that's got a lot of evidence in terms of perfectionism. And there are others. Look, obviously do your homework, but I would say absolutely, seeing someone, talking to someone, really important when it comes to perfectionism, particularly if it's really impacting your day-to-day life.
Yeah. Thomas, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me. It's been great to chat.
Thank you.